So we're now on Daf Samach Amid Beis, and we're going to look at the case of a Minchas Chote, which, as we said on Amid Aleph, is unique in the constellation of Menachos, insofar as that is on the top of Samach Amid Beis Minchas Chova. By contrast, all the other Menachos, and the classic on the list would be the Minchas Nesachim, are all Nidavos. So when the Torah says the word Havei, it means bring this carbon as a chova, again, if he's Dali Dalus, for the Chet. Vinemar, and we find another Vehavei with regard to Minchas Nidova, because that was the pasuk that we began with, Vehevesa. Okay, it's not Vehavei, but Vehevesa, Esa Mincha, and that's referring to the Minchas Maseches, which is a Minchas Nidova. But we're going to compare the two, because in both contexts, the Torah used the same word Haveh, and therefore Ma Minchas Nidova Te'una Hagasha, just like the Torah says in the pasuk of Minchas Marcheshes, Ve'vesas HaMincha, etc., Ve'gisha El HaMizbeach, right? You bring it near the Mizbeach. Af Minchas Chova Te'una Hagasha. So now, because of this equation, I'm not sure if it's Xer Shav. I couldn't figure that out. It's very close to Xer Shav in any event. We now derive the conclusion that Hagasha is a requirement even in a Minchas Chova. And therefore the question arises, why did we need that drush of Hamincha as an extra word to be Marbeg Hagasha in the case of a Minchas Chote, when we already have this equation between a Minchas Nidava and a Minchas Chova as far as requiring Hagosh is concerned? So we have to figure out how we can reject this analogy and therefore justify why we need a pasuk to include, in the case of Minchas Chote, to include Hagosh. And that's what the Gemara says now. Minchas Nidava shekain te'una shemen ulavona. As we said before, a Minchas Chote doesn't require neither shemen nor lavona. So maybe when the Torah is more machmir in a mincha, then once we have those special requirements in a mincha, we'll call it mincha X, then we're going to also, to boot, add hagasha. So what are the extra requirements in a case of a minchas nedova? Shemen and levona. In a minchas chova, in this case a minchas chote, there's no shemen, there's no levona. So therefore, logically, we would come to the conclusion that when the Torah adds X, Y, then it'll add Z as well. Once the Torah added to a minchas nedova, like marcheshes and so forth, levona and shemen and levona, so then the Torah is more machmir, and it would require also hagasha. But in the case of a minchas chote, which does not require neither shemen nor levona, hagasha is left out. It's almost as if we're downgrading the significance of the minchas chote, even though you and I would have said it intuitively, it's more chomer, it's a chova. The guy needs kapara for the avera that he violated. But the Gemara is using a different measuring rod and asking whether or not you need shemen and levona. And in the case of minchas chote, there's no shemen, there's no levona. So the Gemara now is going to tell you that I have a case of a mincha that has no shemen and has no levona, and yet it requires hagasha. So don't tell me that we're piling up chumrah upon chumrah, and that only when we have the chumrah of shemen and levona, only then do we add and attach the chumrah of hagasha, because minchas sota tochiach. In the case of minchas sota, there is no shemen, there is no levona, and yet you require hagasha. Now, how do we know that you require hagasha? So that's a sugya that we're going to get to today, Mirz Hashem, of Rabbi Yehud Vikriva. And he's going to derive from the word Vikriva that in the case of Minchas Sota, there's a requirement of Hagasha. So you see that Hagasha applies even without Shemen and Levona, because the Minchas Sota doesn't have Shemen and Levona. So therefore, don't tell me that we can't derive Minchas Chote from the other Menachos because Minchas Chote doesn't have Shemen and Levona. I'll prove to you that the requirement of Hagasha has nothing to do with Shemen and Levona, because in Minchas Sota there's no Shemen, there's no Levona, and yet there's Hagasha. So the Gemara says, wait a minute. If you go back to our Mishnah once again, it says, Elu tu'unos Hagasha ve'ein tu'unos Tnufa. So take a look at Minchas Chote. Minchas Chote does not require Tnufa. But on this list, we don't find Minchas Sota because we're looking on this list for something that requires Hagasha and does not require Tnufa. So Minchas Chote fits in very beautifully. But Minchas Sota is not on the list. Double check me. I mean, I wouldn't rely on my memory, but I don't think Minchas Sota is on the list of the 10 because Minchas Sota requires Tnufa. So therefore, Malu Minchas Kota Shekein Tuna Tnufa. And now the Gemara is suggesting that maybe Hagasha depends upon Tnufa. Well, that's not true, really. But maybe you might have said that where you don't have Shemen and Levona, i.e., in a Minchas Sota, then Tnufa is what's going to generate Hagasha. So now the answer is Minchas Nedava Tochiach, right? Minchas Nedava does not have Tnufa. I mean, that's the whole list of the 10, that these have Hagasha without Tnufa. And yet they still have Hagasha. So don't tell me that the Gorem here, the relevant factor is Tnufa. When we're dealing with the question of where Hagasha is obligatory, don't talk to me about Tnufa, because a Minchas Nedava, like for example, a Minchas Nesachim, etc., Machvas, Maseches, etc., they don't require Tnufa, and yet they require Hagasha. So therefore, what we could do is what's called a Tzad HaShavah. B'chazar adin, lo roi zeh k'roi zeh. Right, you can't derive any conclusions about Minchas Chote from a Minchas Nedava, because Minchas Nedava, I'm sorry, but let me say it this way. I'm going to say it this way. I hope I'm getting it right. There's a lot of calculations. We cannot prove a thing from Minchas Sota that Minchas Sota, which does not require Shemen Ulavona, nevertheless it requires Hagasha. And now you're going to slug me up and say, well, I can't derive any conclusions from Minchas Sota because Minchas Sota requires Tnufa. Well, now I'm going to invoke the case of a Minchas Nedava, which doesn't require Tnufa, and yet it requires Hagasha. And then again, Lo Roi Zeh K'Roi Zeh. But Atzad HaShavah Shebehem Sheshavu L'Kmitza V'Shavu L'Hagasha, and therefore Afani Avi Minchas Chotish Shavu Lehem L'Kmitza Tishva Lehem L'Chagasha. So again, the Bryce is making a full swing around to tell you that I could derive Minchas Chote as far as Hagosh is concerned without a special limud of Hamincha from a Tzad because the tzad of these two chiyuvei agosha, namely a minchas sota and a minchas nedava, is that in both cases you require kmitza. So now the Gemara is saying through this, through employing this method and this logic of tzad we're going to derive the conclusion that kmitza is what generates hagosha. And if that be the case, then we could certainly fit Minchas Chote into the picture because Minchas Chote requires Kmitza. And hence we require Hagosha. So once again, we're back to square one. Why do you need a pasuk to include Hagosha in the case of Minchas Chote? And now the Gemara has to slug up the Tzad HaShaveh, Mal Tzad HaShaveh Shemehem, Shekain Hukshu, Lavo Bi Ashir Ke'ani. There's a chumrah in all the menachos. For example, in our two cases of minchas sota and minchas nedava, that even an ani would have to bring that mincha. But tomar minchas choti shukshul love b'yoshikani. But the case of a minchas chote, as we said before, it's a carbon olive yored, and only the dali dalis, the lowest financial level, only he brings such a mincha. So the Torah might be more machmir in the case of a carbon mincha that's brought by an ashir and an ani. For example, minchas sota, minchas nedava, than the case of a minchas chote, which can only be brought by an ani. Now, I have to admit to you that what tickles my brain here is the Gemara operating with a logical analysis here, or it's just technical? Meaning I can't compare A to Y or A to B because of a difference between the two. My intuition tells me that there's more here than some technicality. I can't put my finger on it. I mean, because I think what the Gemara, again, this is so speculative what I'm about to say. It's probably dog v'tishkach, forget that I said it, but I just feel intuitively the Gemara is saying that the fact that the Torah made an allowance, like almost a compromise, for the anius, for the poverty-stricken person here, to get away with like peanuts, if you know what I mean, like with the cheapest kind of a carbon, which is the minchas chote. It's made up of flour. There's not even shemen or levona in it. It's like mamish, the austere, the dali dalis, the cheapest of the thing. And hagosha is appropriate for an elaborate kind of mincha. Touching the mizbeach, like in a sense, elevates the mincha. So maybe we might not want to elevate the mincha v'chote. For that, I need a special pasuk, tamalomer es mincha, and therefore we need that ribui that even a minchas chote requires hagosha. Now we go on to the omer, minchas haomer. And Minchas HaOmer is likewise on this list. Let's just be absolutely sure. One second. Now I don't see it on the list. One second. Because Minchas HaOmer requires Tnufa. Let me see if I'm right about that. Second. Just taking a peek at the next Mishnah here. Elu tiros tnufa. And let's see if the Omer is on the list. Just to make sure I'm not messing up over here. Yeah, Minchas Omer is on the list. So Minchas Omer requires Tnufa. That's why it doesn't appear in our Mishnah, because our Mishnah is only those Menachos that require Haggasha without Tnufa. So now, intuitively, again, I would say that if Minchas Omer requires Tnufa, then it's on a higher level, and for sure we require Haggasha. But the Gemara is not sure about that. And the Gemara says, in the name of Shimon, that Vaivesa, apparently the word Vaivesa is an extra word at the beginning of Vayikra. Vaivesa, not sure exactly what it could have said without Vaivesa. I don't know. Oh, so again, it could be that Reb Shimon is not talking about the superfluous nature of the word Vaivesa, but rather he's looking at the word itself and comparing it to another word, right? Vaivesa, right, with regard to a minchas nedov, it says Vaivesa, esa mincha, blah, 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 veigisha, and l'rabos minchas ha'omer la gosha, v'chein omer vavesem esa omer reishis k'tzirchem elakoin. So again, we see the word vavesem, and we're going to make an analogy between the two, and therefore we're going to require Hagosha in the case of an omer. So again, I'd have to put this on the blackboard so we come back to it tomorrow. But I think what we're saying is that an omer, the minchas omer, requires both Hagosha and Tnufa. Again, I'm just going to take a split second to double check that. Elu Tnus, nah. Okay, I'm not sure. Now I'm questioning myself, but we'll see as we go along. I think I'm right that the Omer requires both Hagosha and Tnufa. Maybe.
Yeah, the chart I'm looking at says that.
Oh, you have a chart?
Yeah,
Can you send that to me?
sure.
Great, because I desperately need a chart. I got a chart for yesterday's year, but I only received it today, so it doesn't help me for yesterday's year.
Yeah, this one is just general charts.
It, it
Awesome.
could it could help me if it has Hagosha and Tnufa, it could help me. Okay, so from what you could tell, I didn't make any mistake here, and the Omer requires both Hagosha and Tnufa. And how do we know, says Reb Shimon, that the Omer requires Hagosha? That we know because of this equation between Vavesa in Minchas Nedava and Vevesem es HaOmer in the Minchas HaOmer. Next, Vihikriva. So again, it says Vahavesa, and then it says Vihikriva. And I have a feeling that Vihikriva is an extra word here. And what do we derive from Vihikriva? L'rabos minchas sota lehagosha. So again, we've been operating all along with this piece of information that Minchas Sota requires Hagosha, even though the Minchas Sota has no Shemen and has no Levona. And that pasuk in Bamidbar Perik Hey is referring to the Sota. And here in the note, he quotes the Shita Mekubetzes that this is a Gzeres Shova. Vidinu. Now the Gemara is saying that I could derive minchas sota in Hagosha without this extra pasuk, this drasha vikriva, because ma minchas chote she'ena te'una tnufa, right? In a certain sense, minchas sota is an upgrade on minchas chote, because although both minchas chote and minchas sota are very similar in that they are menachos of chova and they don't have shemen or levona, but nevertheless there is something unique about minchas sota as opposed to minchas chote, in that minchas sota requires tnufa. Is ma minchas chote she'ena tuna tnufa una gosha. Yet we know that a minchas chote requires hagasha. And that was the Gemara that we had in Amanal from the Pasuk V'es HaMincha. Is Mincha Sota is certainly one upgrade because Tu'una Tnufa Enudin Shetuna Hagasha. And therefore, based on this Kal V'chomer, we would absolutely be certain that a Minchas Sota requires Hagasha because of a Minchas Chote, which doesn't require Tnufa, and yet it requires Hagasha. How much more so? The Minchas Sota that requires Tnufa will require Hagasha. Ma, now the Gemara looks up the Kal V'chomer, Ma le Minchas Chote shekaim ba chitim. I'm going to tell you that Minchas Chote is on a higher level than Minchas Sota. Minchas Sota comes from Siora, from barley. That's the lowest level of flour. And Minchas Chote, like any other mincha, comes from Chita. So the special downgrade of Minchas Sota, insofar as it's a mincha brought from Siora, now would lead me to the conclusion, if I didn't have a special pasuk, says Reb Shimon, that a minchas sota does not require agasha. Which again, you have to figure it out. It does require tenufa, but it doesn't require agasha. So the Gemara now says, I'm going to give you a case of a mincha that comes from barley, and nevertheless, it requires agasha. So we see that the fact that it's barley as opposed to wheat is not a downgrade. Minchas ha'omer tochiach, right? So minchas ha'omer is made from barley as opposed to shtei lechem, right? 7 weeks later. But minchas ha'omer is made from barley, and yet it requires hagasha. So don't tell me that the minchas sota should be downgraded and you don't need hagasha because the minchas sota comes from barley. I'll prove to you that barley is not my level of morid as far as hagasha is concerned, because in the case of the omer, even though it's coming from barley, we require hagasha. So the Gemara says, Ma'ale minchas haomer. You want to bring a proof of minchas haomer? She came to una shemen ulevona. It's in the balance of things, I could still put minchas omer on a higher level than minchas sota, because minchas sota doesn't require shemen ulevona, but minchas haomer requires shemen ulevona. So even though you do have a point when you're saying that both minchas sota and minchas haomer require only suffice barley, you don't need wheat, but nevertheless, I would still upgrade the minchas haomer over and above the minchas sota, because the minchas haomer requires shemen ulevona. So now we're going to say, so what are we saying now? That the requirement of hagasha is generated or conditional on shemen ulevona, which applies to omer and not to sota. But wait a minute, minchas chote tochia. What about the case of minchas chote? Minchas chote, like minchas sota, doesn't require shemen or levona, and yet it requires hagasha. So don't tell me that hagasha is generated by or conditional on levona and shemen. Because din lo roi zekaroi zev lo roi zekaroi zev tzara shavu shahem sheshavu lekmitza v'shavu lehagasha afani avi minchas sota sheshavsa lahen kekmitza tishvel lehem lagasha. Why do I need a pasuk to tell me, as Reb Shimon darshan it, v'hikriva, that a minchas sota requires hagasha? Why don't I derive from this sarashaveh and the bottom line of this tzad shava that once you have kmitza, then it's the kmitza that generates hagasha. And of course, a minchas sota requires kmitza. The only thing that doesn't require kmitza is a mincha that's kulei kolil. I'm sorry, that's kulei kolil. Okay, so at this point, just to make sure we know where we're holding in the page, we have it tzad shava. We don't understand why we need a ribui to derive hagosh in the case of minchas sota. Mala tzad shava shebhem. I'm going to slug up this tzad shava shekain lo hukshu lovo kemach. You want to derive that sota should require hagosha from the fact that the omer requires hagosha. Well, guess what? Oh, so here I think we have to know something about solace. Right. Kemach means fine flour. In the case of the minchas sota, they don't require fine flour. You take the barley, and you don't have, it could be sort of like roughed up. You know what I mean? It doesn't have to be refined. But in the case of the omer, even though it comes from barley, but nevertheless it requires kemach, which means, let's see how he formulates it here. So with regard to both the Minchas Homer and for that matter Minchas Chote, we require solace. As I state in Pasuk, fine wheat flour in the case of Minchas Minchas Chote, and the Omer it says mi girsha umishmana, finely ground barley flour. In Minchas Sota, however, all we need is regular flour. We don't need finely ground flour. And that's based on a pasuk again in Parshas Naso. It says, "Vehevi is karbana oleha asiris haifa kemach siorim." Yes, so kemach siorim as opposed to soles. So therefore, we don't know that we're going to apply the requirement of hagasha to minchas sota. Talmud lomar vekriva. Okay, now we have Rabbi Yehuda. Let me just see where we're holding as far as the clock is concerned. Oh boy, we're not doing too good. Rabbi Yehuda Omer v'hevesa l'rabos minchas sota lagosha. So he doesn't want to derive it from what was it? V'hikriva. He wants to derive it from v'hevesa. V'cheinu Omer v'hevi es karbana oleha. In minchas sota it says the same word v'hevi, and therefore we should equate it to the pasuk of minchas nedova, and it requires hagosh. So the Gemara now says that according to Rabbi Yehuda, well, minchas omer lo tzricha kara. What do you mean? Are you telling me that I don't need a pasuk for minchas haomer and my timer? And the only way I could justify this is by saying midina ka'asya. It would seem that we could derive from a din, right? For din is a kal v'chomer, that the minchas haomer requires hagosh. Ma minchas chote she'ena tuna tnufa tu'una gosha minchas haomer she'tuna tnufa in a din she'tu'una gosha, right? Because minchas haomer has one uppit, one chumrah on top of minchas hachote, and that's the requirement of tnufa. And therefore, surely I would derive the conclusion minchas haomer requires hagasha no less than minchas chote. And now the Gemara slugs up the Kavachon by saying Malu Minchas Chotish came Bachite. We have to downgrade Minchas Omer because it comes from barley as opposed to Minchas Chote that comes from Chita. The Gemara says, I don't buy that logic because Minchas Sota Tochiach. We require Agosh and Minchas Sota despite the fact that it comes from barley. The Gemara says that's not a proof because Malu Minchas Sota came Bolivar Ovan. Maybe the reason why the Torah is so machmir and upgrades and adds the requirement of Agosh in the case of Minchas Sota is because it's based on chet, meaning she violated the kiddush and steer of the Baal. Demaskeris Amon, and the purpose is, to clarify whether she was guilty as accused. So the Gemara says Minchas Choti Tochiach. That's also a chet, and yet it requires Hagosh. So don't tell me that the reason why Minchas Sota cannot be the source and the source for Hagosh is because Minchas Sota is coming for Chet. Minchas Chota is also coming for Chet, and yet it requires Hagosha. Just 1 second here. And outside of Shavuot again, we come back to Kmitza. Shekain Shavuot Kmitza, Shavuot Lagosh, Afani Ovi Minchas HaOmer, Sheshav Solehem Kmitza, Tishvelem Lakatza, Umay Parchis. Right, you can't slug this up. So we know now that Minchas HaOmer requires Hagosha. But yet Rav Shimon himself derives Hagosha and Minchas HaOmer from the Pasuk Vayvesa. Is Rav Shimon Parachachi? He rejects this Tzadishava. He says, "Ma Tzadishava sheben shekain mitzuyin." Oh boy, this is a doozy. The Gemara is saying now that the Omer is not matzui. Why? Because we only beat the Omer once during the entire course of the year. But Minchas Chote or Minchas Sota, that's already matzui. Probably the word matzui here means that it can happen many times within the course of a year. Rabbi Yehuda, right? He doesn't accept that logic of Rabbi Shimon. Adarab, he says, Pufik, the opposite is true. Hamitzuya Tfei. The very fact that you're guaranteed that the Minchas Omer has to come at least once a year makes it more shchiach. Hanach zimnin de lo shchiach mishkach seklal. Could be you could go a whole year round without the chait of whatever it is entering through the Migdash B'tumah, or without the chait of kiddush v'stira. Okay, now we're back to the Bryce. Oh, Eino Omer Vavesa. Maybe you might argue that when the Torah says Vavesa, Ella, this only applies to a Yochid Misnadi V'Mevi Mincha Cheres. Right, so we're talking about a Minchas Nedava. Chutz mi Ele Sheba Inyan. So just 1 second, where are we holding now? Again, we're talking about the Minchas HaOmer, El Sheyochid. Reb Shimon Ravesa teaches that you need Agosh in the Omer. According to Rabbi Yehuda, teaches that you need it in Sota. Okay, so what's this O Eino Omer Vavesa? Ah, let's go back to the pasuk again. For this we needed a blackboard. If I vesas hamincha shayasame ela, and then la shem. So now we want to know what is me'ela. So let's say we're talking about a minchas nedava, which is brought by a voluntary pledge. And the Torah has a list of 5 different voluntary menachos. We got soles, marcheshes, machvas, and minchas mafe, which comes either chalos or rikikin is 5. So the Torah writes concerning all 5 voluntary menachos that they are be brought from soles, fine wheat flour. I only know that a private individual may donate a mincha made from wheat flour. And therefore, maybe the word vivesa is teaching that an individual may also donate a mincha made of barley, vidinu. Tzibur may be mincha min achitim chova. Right? In the case of shtei lechem, we have chita. And it's a carbon tzibur, and it's a carbon chova. Maybe mincha min asorim chova. You also have the case of the omer, which is made of siorim. It's also a tzibur chova. Af yachid shemevi mincha min hachitim nidava. Okay, so now the yachid wants to bring a voluntary mincha made of chita. Is yavi mincha min asorim nidava? Maybe he should be allowed to bring a voluntary mincha made of barley. Talmud lomer ela. Right, that was the pasuk ela that we said was a mid. Ainly ela ela. Maybe only these menachos. The Torah says ela. So the 5 categories of voluntary menachos are all coming from chita, not from siora. So therefore, I need this. So again, chutz me'levina means what? That I can bring in a dova? No, I don't think so. I'm under the gun here with the just got stuck here. According to Reb Shimon, fine. Vesa teaches you that you need agosha for the omen. According to Reb Yehuda, it teaches you that the sota needs agosha. So now we have a third possibility. We want to know, why isn't it acceptable? Oh, Omer, perhaps I would suggest the following possibility: that Vesa Ela sheyochim isnayim maybe mincha cheres. I think he means by mincha cheres beyond the 5. Chutz me ela shebe'inyan. Now, what does that mean? Chutz me ela shebe'inyan. Those are the 3 words that are bumbling my mind. Besides the voluntary menachos listed in the Torah, fine, which are all brought soles chita. I only know that a private individual may donate a mincha made from wheat flour. Perhaps the word vivesa is teaching that an individual may also donate a mincha made of barley flour. And vidinu, right? We have a case of the tzibur that brings mincha mina siorin, and therefore the individual could also bring a voluntary mincha mina chitin. Right, so that's the shtei fine. Is then, but why not go a step further and say yavi mincha min hasaorim nidava, right? Because the tzibur brings from mincha min hasaorim chova. Talmud lomer ela ainli ela ela. So the word ela is not teaching that you could bring a voluntary mincha of barley, but let's interpret it the other way around, like Reb Shimon or Reb Yehud. So now the Raisa questions and says, "O Eina Omer Ele Ella Li Omer Re'elai Mincha Shemevi Chamishtan." Maybe you would think that he has to voluntarily take upon himself all five Menachos that are voluntary. Talmud Omer Mei Ela. What is Mei Ela? One of these. Rotza Achas Mevi, Rotza Chamishtan Mevi. So again, I think the bottom line is that we don't use Me'el as a miyut that tells me he has to bring all five, but rather we're going to be Mamayit a carbon nedava of Siorim. That's the way I understand it. I'll just add 2 more minutes. I have to go to Mincha. I'm sure you're busy too. Rabbi Shimon Omer Eshad Mincha, Rabbi Sha'ar Menachos. Kigon Minchas Nochri, Minchas Noshim Le'agosha. Yochel Shani Marba Avshtei Alechem Alechem Aponim. Maybe they also need Agosha. Tamalomer Mei Eila. So that's how Reb Shimon interprets the miyud of Mei Eila. Umar Rois L'Rabbo Shar Menachos Ulahotzi Shtei Alechem Alechem Aponim. Why do you assume that all menachos require agosh except for shtei alechem aponim? Marbani is shar menachos sheyesh ma mehen ishim. Right, all other menachos are brought on the eish, on the mizbeach. Umotzi ani, but I'm not going to require agosha to shtei alechem aponim she'ein mehen beishim. No, nothing goes on the mizbeach. Frek the Gemara v'lo minchas esachim kulo leishim. So now the Gemara is assuming that maybe that which goes on the Eish is going to be matir the Shirayim, but in the case of Minchas Nesachim, it's kulo leishim. It's entirely burnt. Again, not to be equated with Minchas Soles, which is the voluntary. We're talking about now a Minchas Nesachim that accompanies a carbon ola or a carbon shlomim, and it has to be completely burnt on the Mizbeach, which is a sugya later on a daf ayin dalit. Yochel yehituna gosha. I might think that even a minchas nesachim requires hagosha tamlon v'hikri va, and that excludes minchas nesachim from hagosha. So again, it's a little bit counterintuitive because you would think that since a minchas nesachim is kulei kolil, then maybe we should be more machmer and certainly require agosha. But anyway, the Gemara goes a different way. This seems to indicate it's very technical, in terms of what we can equate not. So Gemara asks, v'afikte, Reb Shimon already used the word, hakava, the karva, to teach me that sotus mincha has to require agasha, and the Gemara is going to say v'hikriv v'kriva. If it only had said v'hikriv, you're right, we can only derive one conclusion, but it says v'kriva, and now we're going to derive two conclusions. Umara isa l'rabo shar menachos ulahotzi minchas nesachim. Ma'beni shar menachos shebos biglal atzma motzi ani minchas nesachim she'ena bo biglal atzma. Right, the minchas nesachim is only generated as a auxiliary, as an accompaniment to the carbon ola, carbon shlam. Okay, then this is where we'll stop. So Mr. Hashem, tomorrow is Friday, so we get together at 9:30. Is that correct?
9